Geography 5, Cultural Diffusion and Diversity. Why do men around the world today wear ties? The idea that a tie is the proper neckwear for professional men in modern times spread from the Croats, a group in Eastern Europe, to the French in the 1600s. From there it spread to England and much of the rest of the world. The term anthropology comes from the Greek words for the study of man, or more broadly, the study of humanity. Anthropology includes the study of culture. The intersection of anthropology and geography is called cultural geography or human geography. Culture defined. The word culture has several meanings. The meaning of culture in this context refers to the ideas, behaviors, and material things common to a group of people. Going back to our early example, a necktie is a material thing that expresses an idea about how a professional man ought to appear. Wearing a tie, and even the way you tie a necktie, is a behavior. Some companies, some groups have a certain knot. Members are expected to learn the knot and use that knot for their neckties for events involving the group. Cultural diversity means the variety of groups of people in an area. The many immigrant groups that have arrived in the United States in the past 500 years make America culturally diverse. Cultural diffusion. The transfer of one group's unique traits to another group is cultural diffusion. For example, pizza started as an Italian dish but became popular in the United States. The spread of pizza from Italy to the United States is an example of cultural diffusion. There are three types of cultural diffusion: direct, indirect, and forced. Direct cultural diffusion occurs when two groups are geographically close to each other. Events that cause direct cultural diffusion would include intermarriage. People from one group marry people in the other group. The families merge the traditions and cultures. Commerce, doing business with another group. You gain their material items, you communicate with them, you exchange ideas. Fighting. Even warfare can lead to direct cultural diffusion. For example, when the Europeans went on crusade and attacked the Islamic world, they came back with knowledge of science and math that existed in the Islamic world but had been lost to Western Europe. Direct cultural diffusion frequently happened in Louisiana. Louisiana's Afro-Creole culture began with the intermarriage of African and French colonists. Gumbo and okra came from Africa to Louisiana. So Louisiana was a place where we see a lot of cultural diffusion. There were many groups there: Native American, African, Europeans of different groups, not only the French and Spanish, but many Eastern Europeans, Germans, and other groups came over. And as they came together, their cultures blended in a unique way that makes Louisiana the special place it is today. Indirect cultural diffusion. Sometimes cultural traits are transferred through an intermediary without contact between the original culture and the most recent culture to acquire a certain trait. The necktie example we discussed earlier in the presentation is an example of indirect cultural diffusion if we examine the transfer of the custom of wearing neckties from Croatia through France and eventually to Japan. Today in Japan, men wear neckties to work. Did the Japanese and Croats have a great deal of communication in the past? No. But the French and the English communicated the idea to Japan through trade. The adoption of civil law instead of common law in Louisiana history is an example of indirect cultural diffusion. Civil law, based on a written law code, is rooted in ancient Roman law. In contrast, law based on the precedent set by judges over the centuries is known as common law and is the legal system common to England and its former colonies. So Alabama and the federal government and the other states are under common law, the law that came from what the English judges did in the medieval period and after. Civil law came through the Romans and then through the mainly Spanish to Louisiana. You may think, Mr. Blankenship, perhaps you meant to say the French, because the French colonized Louisiana. While the French did originally colonize Louisiana, they transferred the colony to the Spanish. The Spanish ruled it for most of the 40 years before it was acquired by the United States for a brief stint under Napoleon. And therefore, the law code and even the architecture is really more Spanish than French. The French Quarter has very little French architecture. It looks much more like Spain. If you went to Madrid or Barcelona, the ironwork, the architecture looks much more like the French Quarter of New Orleans than anything in France. Civil law passed from the Roman Empire to Spain and finally to Louisiana. Louisiana is the only state in the U.S. under civil law. If you go to law school at LSU, you get degrees both as a lawyer, a JD, but you also get a master's degree in civil law, which may be useful in talking with lawyers in Latin America and in Europe, where civil law is the law of the land. Forced cultural diffusion. An unfortunate reality of world history is the domination of some groups of nations by other groups of nations. Conquest and enslavement involves the forced transfer of traits from the dominant culture to the oppressed culture. The Romans imposed their government and language and their laws on the many nations that they conquered and forced them to adopt Roman ways. Now, some groups willingly adopted Roman ways. That's not forced cultural diffusion. That's direct cultural diffusion because they chose to do so. When they had no choice, when the Romans rolled in and conquered an area, that was forced cultural diffusion. The enslavement of Africans and African Americans is an example of forced cultural diffusion in history. Slaves were punished for speaking their native languages and practicing their religion and customs. They were forced to learn the language and customs of their oppressors. In conclusion, cultural geography describes how humans interact with their environment and each other. Culture refers to the ideas, behaviors, and material things common to a group of people.